Hello. The Warhammer world was the work of countless games designers, writers, artists, and creators. It developed over many decades and many products. But there were some key individuals who helped drive that creation. My guest today was one of the architects of the early Warhammer world through Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, responsible for some of its finest writing, some of its funnest adventures, and for its continued presence as a grim and perilous setting for the greatest of role-playing campaigns. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with Graeme Davis. Thank you so much for joining me. I wonder if we might start by just talking a little bit about how you came to be working at Games Workshop in the mid 80s.
Sure. Yeah. Well, to start at the beginning, I finished school in 1976, but I didn't have the grades to get into uni. So I took a job in a bank for 3 years and studied by correspondence. And um, the bank job really, I was a really bad fit for that. So to kind of keep myself sane as a hobby, I joined a local Amdram group. And as it so happened, this was in Bracknell in Berkshire, and the computer company ICL had a big presence there at the time. I think they're part of Fujitsu Siemens now. Anyway, that doesn't matter. But there were some of the younger lads in the drama club had just finished college themselves, and they'd picked up a game there called Dungeons and Dragons. And they tried to explain it to me, and they said it's sort of 50% miniatures war game and 50% improvised theatre. And I could not reconcile those two in my mind. So I thought there's only one thing for it. I'll have to go along and see what it's really about. Um, and by 1977 or so, we were playing pretty much every weekend, and I was completely hooked. And when I did go to uni, I took that with me. Um, and of course, by that time I was subscribing to White Dwarf, and they put out they were bi-monthly at the time, and there was always readers' letters saying, "When are you going to go monthly? When are you going to go monthly?" And Jamie Thompson, who was the editor at the time, made a severe tactical error by saying, "Well, we don't have the content." So I for the next 2 years or so, I was sending them 3 or 4 articles a month until they finally realized I wasn't going to go away, and they published one. And this was in White Dwarf 32, which was, I think, June, July 1982. And it worried several people who'd known me, because it was actually a subsystem for seedy living and drug addiction and stuff like that, which you could publish for AD&D in those days. Probably not publishable today at all. Anyway, in due course, a small check appeared, and that was it. I went straight to the college bar, exchanged the check into Theakston's XB with all due dispatch, and then went back to my room to write more. And then fast forward 4 years when I was working on a PhD project that was not going well. And in the meantime, I'd started writing for Imagine as well.
Hmm.
And Games Workshop knew me by that time as a reliable freelancer, and they were putting a team together to do Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And I like to tell people that, Jim Bamber and Phil Gallagher came across from TSR UK, but Graham Morris didn't. He wanted to stay in Cambridge and continue his academic life. So there was a vacancy for a Graham, and so I got a job. So around about May 1986, I moved down from Durham and started working in Nottingham. And there was a huge draft, or actually probably 3 partial drafts by Rick Priestley, Richard Halliwell, and Bryan Ansell, that I started to fold together and sort out. And yeah, that's how I got started.
Right. Wow. So you came in and you were just sort of thrown in the deep end then to take a look at this enormous ongoing project.
Yes, it was like, here, you know about role-playing games, have this. Because they were all war games designers, you know, because originally Warfrup was intended, or Warhammer Roleplay as it was known then, was intended as a one-off supplement for Warhammer Second Edition, the red box version. Um, and that's where all these piles of stuff came from, and that's how some of the systems ended up the way they are. Because if you look at the skills in Warfrup First Edition, they're just one-offs. You either have them or you don't, and that's really points to the origins in war games design, because they're essentially unit traits. And there wasn't really time to fix that and turn it into a percentage-based skills system, because I arrived in May. We had to get the thing to the printers in October to ship in November for the Christmas market of 1986, and that was set in stone. So.
Right. So that must have been quite a job then for you and the guys coming from TSR UK to
It
turn it into
was,
something that
yeah.
was sellable.
It was, you know, we'd all also, you know, I think Bryan in particular was expecting basically a dungeon bash game. He wanted it, in his words, to stand toe to toe with D&D.
Hmm.
But Jim and Phil and I and the other folks from TSR, Paul Coburn, Mike Brunton, Tom Kirby, uh, we'd all been exposed to the early editions of Call of Cthulhu, and we had a very different idea of where the state of the art was in terms of role-playing games.
Hmm.
And that's kind of the impetus of how Warfrup developed a very different flavor from Warhammer Battle.
Yeah, because it really took to a much lower level version of that
Mhm.
world, right? And started to explore
Yeah,
it in that way. But so who
yeah.
was the sort of, was it really a collaborative effort with everyone kind of steering it in that way? Did it evolve organically into that sort of slightly different version of the world?
Yeah, I don't think a firm decision was ever taken. You know, as a matter of policy, this is how we're going to do it. It's just we all had this shared view of this is what a role playing game needs to be in late 1986. Um, and also, in a way, it was kind of a reaction to everything that frustrated us about D&D at the time. That you know, it was sort of simplistic hack and slash. Um, there was a kind of a culture war going on at the time, particularly in the London fanzines, um, where because younger players were coming into the game around that time. It was no longer a sort of an undergraduate secret.
Hmm.
And, you know, imagine used to have some subscribers as young as 8 years old. And so they were all into, you know, how many times can you kill Orcus and get, you know, how many versions of his wand can you get for your character? Um, and this was looked down a bit by the people who dubbed themselves role gamers, whose what they used to boast about was how they'd gamed for an entire weekend and never touched the dice once. Um, and we were, you know, we were sort of tending to the latter camp, although we weren't sort of firm advocates of either approach. But we just thought it was far more interesting, you know, having to be low powered in a hostile world. Um, you have to remember this was also the Thatcher era. It was 2 years after the miners' strike, and you know, being good sort of left-leaning, lower middle class and middle class college graduates, that was kind of our mindset as well. And there's a certain amount of satire in there, particularly in the way the nobles, the nobility of the empire is described. Because at the time, the current Earl Spencer was Viscount Althorpe, Champagne Charlie, as he was known. And the Bullingdon Club was in full cry, wrecking restaurants and debagging waiters. And I'd seen some of that at Durham. Jim and Phil had seen a lot more at Cambridge. And so, you know, it was just kind of our shared mindset.
Yeah. So I mean that then all sort of came together because it really does feel a bit like that the alchemy of taking Dungeons and Dragons and the influences from that have gone into Warhammer Fantasy Battle at that point as well.
Mm.
And like you say, that Call of Cthulhu sort of approach. So were you thinking there was going to be more than just that one supplement at that point as it sort of started to grow as a thing, or was it still just we'll
Yeah.
get this one done and then move on to something else?
No, no, I think by the time they brought on a team of role-playing writers, uh, that was implicit commitment that it was going to be a range, it was going to be a product line. And at the time, of course, Citadel and Games Workshop had just merged. Um, TSR UK was now handling AD&D, which had been a big earner in the early days of Games Workshop. And although we still had license agreements with Chaosium over RuneQuest and Call of Cthulhu and subsequently Stormbringer and a couple of others, I think there was the need was felt for a flagship role-playing game, and particularly a fantasy one, to as Brian's exact words were, to stand toe to toe with AD&D. And it was a logical offshoot to grow the Warhammer brand as well.
Yeah, yeah, it does make a lot of sense from that business perspective as well to give
Mm.
you another avenue to start fleshing out that world. I mean, what was that approach how did you sort of go about adding the flesh to the bones of the Warhammer world, as it were? Because even in second edition of the Fantasy Battle game, there still wasn't as clear a version of the Warhammer world as we might recognize it today. That obviously started to come together with all the supplements and extra stuff, but what was that process like for you?
Um, well, the work had already partially been done in the drafts that awaited me. I think Rick had tried to get everything together. I also combed back through all the Citadel journals and compendia and miniatures ads and everything, and I tried to gather together every little bit of setting that had ever seen print, and then kind of put it together in a way that worked and flesh out the details, fill in the gaps. And yeah, that's kind of, and at that time it was only one chapter in the book, so it wasn't that big a job. A lot was done with the enemy within to flesh out the empire. And the intention long term was to do the similar thing to other parts of the world. Richard Hallowell was working on his Lustria campaign,
Mhm.
and which has now passed into legend. And we were thinking of doing. I mean, there was always the constant pressure to do Albion because we were a British role-playing game, of which there were very few at that time. We weren't the first, but we might have been the second. And yeah, so where was I? Yeah, as I said, it was only one chapter, so it wasn't too bad, particularly as we were focusing on the Empire. And Jim and Phil, when they were sketching out the outlines of the enemy within campaign, they took what was written for the Empire and fleshed it out into, I think, what ended up being about half of that world setting chapter.
Right. Right.
So,
I mean, that enemy within campaign, just on that, was like a very. I mean, that obviously has stood the test of time. It's a highly regarded campaign, really, the sort of the pinnacle of sort of long form campaign writing for a lot of role players. Obviously, there
mm,
was a lot of collaborative work in that as well. How
mm.
did you sort of get stuck into that?
Well, initially, before Jim and Phil came on board, Bryan came to me and asked me to write the first module using the language of the day. And he said he wanted, these were his exact words, a bloodless Call of Cthulhu adventure for Warhammer. So the result was Shadows over Bergenhafen. And when Jim and Phil arrived, they had just done a module for, I think it was BECMI D&D. It was the BX1, otherwise known as B10, called Night's Dark Shadow, which was supposed to be a transitional module to get you from basic to expert rules, and introduce the concept of campaign play. So they put a lot of thought into that. It is still, in my opinion, an outstanding module. They'd set up a campaign sandbox area before sandbox was even the term people used, and seeded various adventures around the place. So they probably, in Britain at least, were the experts on what a role-playing campaign was. And they were the driving force behind that. They incorporated Shadows over Bogenhafen as one episode, but it really hit its stride with Death on the Reich and then Power Behind the Throne. And the way we worked was that Jim and Phil were very used to working together very closely. Jim was a great ideas guy and Phil was a great organizer. And so they would be working on one thing, I would be working on another, and then we'd switch and develop each other's work. So, they developed Shadows over Bogenhafen, I developed The Enemy Within / Mistaken Identity. And then when Death on the Right came around, they handled the adventure, and I wrote the River Life of the Empire supplement. It continued sort of in that vein until I got rather pigeonholed as a developer of other people's work, which was a little frustrating at times, although I still wrote stuff for White Dwarf.
Yeah, you were doing quite a lot of White Dwarf articles and stuff as well through that time, it seems. In particular, one of my favorites being the Marienburg series that you did.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, that was an incredible undertaking. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what sort of drove the creation of Marienburg in those pages.
Yeah, certainly. We have to skip back to Imagine, and they had an ongoing serialized setting called the City League, set in the world of Pellinor, but mainly the City League was the emphasis. And every issue they had 6 or 8 pages, 2 or 3 locations with NPCs and adventure seeds. And I don't know if you go back far enough to remember those part works that used to appear in W.H. Smith's, where you could sort of get a magazine each month and it built up into an encyclopedia.
Oh, yeah.
Over the, yeah. And so few of them ever reach conclusion, but so it was that sort of approach to creating a fantasy setting, and in particular a fantasy city. Now, at that time, there were supplements out for fantasy cities. In the early days, there had been the city-state of the Invincible Overlord, but more recently, TSR had produced their Lankmar supplement for AD&D, which was a very good city supplement. And there were a couple of others whose I can't call to mind right now. But we wanted to do something like that. Was another sort of thing, like it was something a role-playing game should have. It was another sort of element of the state of the art. Plus, given the sort of grubby tone of Woofrup, an urban setting was something that we really needed. And we did do Middenheim to support Power Behind the Throne, and that was very well received. But Tom Kirby and Mike Brunton and I were still kind of interested in doing the serialized thing, because it could be completely open-ended. You didn't have to work to a particular deadline. And also, it had this modular quality where people could just sort of pick and choose what they wanted and drop them into their own campaigns. They didn't have to use the whole thing. So eventually it was decided to do that in Marienburg. We got a freelancer called Anthony Reagan to kick it off, and he went on to become quite a figure, and still is very active in Woofrup fandom, particularly first edition. And I need some more tea.
Sure.
See if that gets my mouth moving better. Yeah, we decided, and it was part of Flame's remit when that was set up, that we would produce one book of 80 to 128 pages every 2 months, I think it was, plus 8 pages for White Dwarf Monthly, and that was mostly going to be Marienburg, but a few other things kind of came along, like sort of promotional pieces for the novels. We statted Gotrek and Felix, for example, or little excerpts of forthcoming products like the Doomstones.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that you started up Constant Drachenfels as well, which seems like
That's right.
a bold campaign choice for anybody who's going to put him in an adventure.
That's right. Well, D&D had Vecna. And in fact, Bryan's when he said he wanted us to write a dungeon based on Castle Drachenfels, he said it was to be Warhammer's answer to the Tomb of Horrors S1. It was supposed to be the dungeon that everybody talked about and nobody beat.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that was quite a success then, in those terms. Yeah. So you mentioned there about the setup of Flame publications as well. So that was the sort of spun off, dedicated imprint that was created by Games Workshop to work
Yes.
purely on Wolfrup, right? So what was the thinking going on there within the business, and so how did that work?
Well, when Wolfrup came out, the first edition of 40K Rogue Trader came out 1 month later, almost to the day. And let's just say it had more of an impact on miniature sales than Wolfrup did.
Sure.
And Bryan was a miniatures guy first, last, and always. He always was worried about not being able to make money off of paper products. So from that point on, the writing was on the wall for role-playing games. The licensed printings of the Chaosium games and a few others were one avenue to kind of get role-playing games out from Games Workshop, keeping the costs down, but still they were still cheaper to buy in the UK than the imported American editions. And looking at Wolfrup, well, Jim had left. Phil had gone into management. We had a few, we still had freelancers like Carl Sargent in particular. But the idea was to cut the costs absolutely to the bone, see what we could produce, and see if it would, be self-sustaining fiscally. And that was the idea behind Flame. And so we had me, first we had freelancers doing all the writing. I was doing the developing. Mike Brunton was doing the layout. He had a Mac and an early version of Quark Express. And we were instructed to use the Games Workshop Art Archive as extensively as possible. But we also had Tony Ackland, who he was he's still alive, bless him. He's a phenomenal artist, the fastest I've ever known, who could turn out a full page piece in a day. And so the three of us were sent to a little office offsite just downstairs from Marauder Miniatures, where they were trying to test the same model with miniatures production. And off we went. And
Right.
we hit the production goals certainly, but the sales figures as they were presented to us, we didn't get to see the raw data, but as they presented to us was that it really wasn't working. And then around that started late '88, I think. And I left in October of 1990, and they various other incarnations. Mike left, and I think Robin Dews and Carl Sargent were on staff for some part of it, and it staggered along for a bit. But after they got Castle Drachenfels out, I think there wasn't really the will within Games Workshop to continue producing role-playing games. They felt that they just weren't sufficiently profitable to justify it. And in terms of developing the setting, the fourth edition was on the way with the first army books, and that was the way the setting was developed. And they started licensing production of Wolfra first to Hogshead, and then they set up the joint venture Black Industries with Green Ronin, and more recently Cubicle 7.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like it wasn't a long period of time from the sort of highs of we've created this really important game, or what would become a really important game and a long-standing game, and would be a sort of source of more lore and story within the Warhammer world. Those highs seem to be followed quite quickly then by the turnaround to actually miniatures games are going to be the driving force now for Games Workshop.
That's right. Yeah, the miniatures were far more profitable, and if you think about the first edition 40K hardback, yeah, it was gorgeously produced. It was expensive. It had full color on almost every page, I think, but it was one book, and that one book drove an awful lot of miniature sales, whereas the core Wolfram rule book didn't. The early editions of the Enemy Within, up to I think Enemy Within, Shadows over Bogenhafen, and Death on the Reich, they included flyers for miniature sales, including some bespoke miniatures for the NPCs and everything. But no role player, really, no GM was going to spend £150 in 1986 on a set of miniatures for one adventure. And that was the point at which the writing started to appear on the wall.
Was there ever, that you were party to, was there ever a conversation about doing a 40K equivalent of Wolfram? Do you know?
Yes, it was sort of in the air from the outset. But like Wolfram itself, it kind of suffered from the fact that role-playing games were nowhere near as profitable using Games Workshop model as miniature games were. There were some, if I remember correctly, in some like chapter approved and some of the early supplements, there were some rules options which were tended a little more towards role-playing.
Yeah.
But it was something that Games Workshop never really was terribly interested in doing for themselves. Although, of course, later on, Fantasy Flight took it up, and I'm not sure if there were any earlier efforts before that.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, that the original Rogue Trader had a sort of, it was kind of in a weird transitional space, I suppose, between role-playing and miniatures games, and it kind of took a few bits of both, but then obviously went so much more into the miniature space, as you say. So,
yeah,
I mean, I guess it just sounds like a very interesting time. A lot of changes, a lot of, like you say, state-of-the-art stuff, discovering what actual stuff works for role-playing across the industry. I mean, was it an exciting time to be working on these kinds of games?
Yeah, it certainly was. It was an exciting time, particularly to be that age and working on these kinds of games and fresh out of college. And somebody once asked me what it was like in the writer's room of the Games Workshop design studio in those years. And the best analogy I can come up with, it was a sort of a gaming equivalent of The Young Ones, if you remember that TV show. It was, fantastic creativity, utter childishness, us seeing what we could get away with in terms of hidden references and in-jokes before management intervened. And it was a time I still look back on with very great affection.
Sure, yeah, because there's so many jokes peppered throughout those books and that series, and I think that definitely contributed to the feel of Warhammer as a, like you said, a satirical setting as well, but one that
Yeah,
was willing to have a bit of fun with the world.
yeah, yeah. We were almost all of us are blessed with the same irreverent slash childish sense of humor, and we just fed off each other in a quite shameful way on occasion. and yeah, it was a lot of fun. And the way we justified it was that, well, it's basically a fantasy horror game, but the horror doesn't mean anything without the humor to leaven it. And it's been a criticism leveled against later editions, or later versions, not just of WFRP but of Warhammer, that it just all got too grimdark and relentless.
Hmm. Yeah, it was definitely a good balance during those early years. I mean, what was it
Mm.
like working with Rick Priestley on the sort of various Warhammer products?
Um, oh, we got along together tremendously well because strange thing, there was a great correlation between role-playing writers of that time and people who had archaeology degrees. I did, Rick did, Nigel Stillman did, Graham Morris, who stayed at TSR, also did. And the rest of the crew were self-taught historians because they'd started with historical wargaming. Um, but Rick and I used to tease each other because he was a medieval specialist, whereas I was a prehistorian, and so we had lots of little in jokes going there that wouldn't mean anything to anyone who hadn't graduated in archaeology in the 80s. So I won't bore you with them here. But yeah, we got along very well at that time. After I came on board and he gleefully offloaded WFRP on me, he went straight into designing 40K. So we sat at adjacent desks and we could have conversations about things, but we were definitely kind of in separate worlds at that point.
Hmm.
Um,
Do you think there's anything in the because obviously in the archaeology, you're looking into the past and exploring worlds that did exist in
yeah.
fantasy and sort of war game creation. You're doing that, but you're looking into a world that didn't exist and making it exist. You think that's the sort of what's going on there? It's the same kind of
Oh, definitely yes, because most fantasy, particularly in those days, most fantasy was set at a medieval social and technological level. So we knew about that stuff, and a lot of the Marienburg stuff I did. Some of the buildings, like a tannery and various other things, businesses. Uh, that came straight out of my notes from my materials technology course.
right.
I was trying to sneak a little bit, well, reuse a little bit of what I'd learned at college, and also try and make it based on something real, so it sort of rang a little more authentically.
Hmm.
Um, so yes, absolutely the case.
You definitely had that ring of, obviously it was true fantasy, but there was a ring of authenticity to the world as well, and maybe that was through that
Mm,
lower level of adventure and power, but also the detail definitely
yeah.
seems to flow through into the products and the stories.
We like to think so.
You mentioned before Richard Halliwell's Lustria
Yeah.
supplement, which would never ended up being released, and I think there was also a
Mm,
Realm of Sorcery supplement that was being worked on as well. Were there any other
yep.
sort of things that were either they were invented but never made it, or like projects that didn't get off the ground, or stuff that was just left on the shelf for Warhammer?
Yeah, there were quite a few. In fact, if you don't mind me plugging, there's a great blog called Awesome Lies,
Oh, it's
which
great.
was, yeah, named after the the news column from White Dwarf back in the day. Um, and Gideon, who runs that, has done a very exhaustive sweep of the forgotten Warhammer products. The one I remember in particular was well, it was actually two things. There was a freelancer called Paul Vernon, um, who had done some stuff for White Dwarf, a lot on cities and economies. He was a sociologist, um, and so he wanted to design, a believable fantasy society and have it working properly. And he had produced a self-published campaign called Starstone, um, a three-adventure campaign. And on the basis of this, Bryan hired him to write a campaign for WFRP, so that we didn't have all our eggs in the same enemy within basket. And we, I have to be honest, I didn't like it. And when we gave him feedback, not just me, but feedback from the whole writing team, um, it became clear that communication was going to be an issue. Uh, we tried him writing a Norska campaign, and that basically became a historical Viking campaign without any Warhammer flavor. And this was a perennial problem we had with freelancers, was capturing that Warhammer flavor, because they weren't in the room with us absorbing all of our silly ideas. And so what we tended to get was either restatted D&D, or the D&D historical reference, or basically someone's college notes with game stats attached, and no one could quite nail the flavor. The only person who could was Carl Sargent, I think.
Mm.
So after the initial campaign, Paul tried Norska setting, and then Border Princes setting, which we thought could be quite a nice balkanized sort of Wild West, anything goes kind of setting. But again, the communication failed us. We got he took the word balkanized a little too literally, and we got a sort of late Ottoman Empire versus Austria kind of feel to everything. And anyway, eventually relations broke down entirely, and I don't think he ever quite forgave us for our response to his work.
Well, I guess, like you say, there is an almost ineffable something about Warhammer as a world, because it is a merger of all of these different inspirations, it seems like that, and it
Yeah.
does come out with a product that is something slightly different to everything that went in. I mean, how would you describe the Warhammer flavor that was lacking there? I mean, what was sort of the secret sauce?
I guess if I had to characterize it, it was uh, a mixture of Tolkien 2000 AD and the Beano, or possibly Viz Comic if they'd done a skit on the Lord of the Rings.
That's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah, that's
You know,
great.
those were our predominant influences at the time, for sure.
So you continue to sort of, well, in fact, with Flame and the sort of move to that, I suppose, was there anything else about the changing culture within Games Workshop that you remember besides the sort of increasing focus on the business of miniatures?
Yes, I think because Games Workshop, by the time I left, was reaching the end of a period of considerable growth and reorganization, and was being much more serious as a business. Um, Bryan had spent a lot of time in the States setting up Games Workshop US. The stores were starting to multiply, and I forget the name for the dealer program, but anyway, the authorized dealers, that whole thing. And so it was becoming far less of a hobby at which we were somehow making a living, and far more of a serious business.
Hmm.
And that's the cultural shift I remember. There one or two more layers of management appeared. So and it became a less clubby atmosphere and more stratified.
Hmm. I suppose that's sort of almost a corporatization, maybe, of the
Yeah,
organization.
the, yeah, the first steps down that road, I think, and absolutely necessary as a business grows. Um, and you can't fault Games Workshop. It's served them very well.
Certainly has, yeah. I mean, and if the growth and the sort of business is the thing, I mean,
Mm.
the sort of I imagine it became more difficult to get the jokes into the books as that started to happen, and there were more managers signing stuff off.
Yes, yes, it did rather. Um, Although it forced us, particularly Tony, Mike, and I at Flame, because we all had a strong sense of mischief in our souls. It forced us. It turned into a sort of an arms race, if you will, where we were trying to sneak jokes in that wouldn't be recognised by management, but which would resonate with the WFRP GMs and players. And but yeah, we got regular memos saying this is, like Graham Chapman in Monty Python, stop that, it's silly. Because Warhammer was trying to take itself far more seriously, as a fantasy IP and as a setting, and that was the first step down the road towards grimdark.
Hmm. And as that became more serious on the sort of battlefield, as it were, was there
Mm.
anything from a story perspective or a sort of lore perspective that you were kind of getting a bit of pushback on and weren't able to do, or was it still quite open to create new stuff?
Um, by the time I left Flame in 1990, it was still very open. People didn't mind much what we did to the setting because the role-playing game worked on a smaller scale uh, in terms of how much world real estate it used, and so we didn't do anything that was world changing. And yeah, we could sort of put something, a little building over here that does this. And, I mean, Castle Drachenfels came from the novels to the role playing game. And then I think Constant Drachenfels, I know he's in Total War Warhammer, and I think he might have been statted for other editions of the game. The Lichmaster went from battle to role play and back again. Um, and so on. So no, there wasn't anything we felt we should push back on at that time. And then, of course, Flame closed down. A couple of years passed. Hogshead got the license, and from my conversations with James Wallace about that period, any pushback always came from Games Workshop. Obviously because they were the license holder. But at that point, any new role-playing material was subjected to quite considerable scrutiny as to how it would impact the parent IP.
Sure, yeah, I guess that was when it became a lot more structured, I suppose, in terms of an IP. Sort of
Yeah, yeah. Structured is a good word for both the IP and the business.
Hmm. And that Hogshead era, I know you weren't necessarily as involved as you had been during the Flame times, but they obviously Anthony Reagan actually did produce that Marienburg book in the end and sort of draw on some of
Yeah.
those notes and that sort of stuff. Was there anything that made its way into the Hogshead run that was stuff that you'd been working on and sort of finally saw the light of day at that point, or was it mostly new?
Um, well, a lot of the Hogshead run was reprints. James reprinted the Enemy Within campaign, as you would, and the Doomstones. The new thing was an ending for the Doomstones. He got Robin Laws to write episode 5, and I had actually put together an outline for Doomstones 5 when I was at Flame. And I know Robin saw that and used parts of it and didn't use other parts. I actually worked on Apocrypha 2, which was partly a compilation of stuff from White Dwarf and Warhammer Companion and, you know, all the old other bits and bobs products. And I think I managed to get a couple of new things into there, although honestly, I can't quite remember what they were now. But yeah, the Marienburg book and Dying of the Light, and of course, finally producing something with the title Realms of Sorcery. That was what Hogshead did that was original.
And then that Wolfrub was reprinted again for Fantasy Flight, and there was quite a different system when they did their third edition, I think.
Yes.
And then now, as you mentioned before, Cubicle 7 are sort of republishing it, and have taken bits of the first and second editions and are sort of revisiting a lot of the classics, I guess, which you've been involved with in those sort of reprints on some of those books as well, haven't you?
Yes, I have. Yeah, the way things emerged in my discussions with Don McDowell of Cubicle 7 was that, you know, everybody liked the setting from first edition. Everybody liked the mechanics from second edition. Not very many people liked very much about third edition. Uh, so let's blend, you know, first and second to make fourth. And they got Andy Law in to do that and various other very talented people. And I think they did a great job. You know, when I heard that this fourth edition was coming, I got in touch with Dom and he said to me, how do you feel about doing a director's cut of The Enemy Within? Which I was absolutely delighted, because there'd been many things I hadn't been happy with about the original. Plus, we'd had 30 years of playtesting, analysis, and feedback. You know, it was a great opportunity. So I got to work on, let me see, the 5 parts of the main campaign, plus each one came with a supplement of additional material. So, for example, the Death on the Reich adventure, the original had the River Life of the Empire supplement bound in. We moved that to a separate book and then added various other mixture of updated and completely new material to help you spend even more time going up and down the river trading and stuff. So it ended up in as 10 volumes. Took me, I think, 2 or 3 years to get that done. But it was a lot of fun to do, and I'm enormously proud of it, especially because the last 2 episodes. Now, the original Enemy Within, the original plan was to have an adventure called The Horned Rat after Power Behind the Throne. But that got supplanted because we had the chance to have Ken Ralston write for us. And he was a very well-known writer in the US at the time. And the thinking was that his name would help boost sales in the US, where, of course, our fight against our competition with AD&D was fiercest, trying to get a toehold. So he wrote Something Rotten in Kislev, and that was slotted into the place that was supposed to have been for the Horned Rat. And then, you know, commercial pressures piled up and everything, and it was decided to get the campaign finished and done with as quickly as possible. So Flame's first task was to take a Carl Sargent manuscript for Empire in Flames and simply get that out. And it was rushed in the writing, it was rushed in the production, and nobody was really happy about it. James Wallace actually refused to reprint it. He planned to do something called Empire in Chaos, all new, but that never happened by the time his license ran out. There's a fan-written one by Mad Alfred Nunez, who's a Wolfrop super fan, called Empire at War that's downloadable and well worth a look. But to return circuitously to my actual point, with the director's cut, I got to do The Horned Rat, which was another sort of lost title that had been floating in the ether for decades. Because Games Workshop had this bad habit of announcing things before the writing had started. And then when they were cancelled or failed to appear, people were saying, you know, what's this? So I got to do The Horned Rat, and I got to reconcept the end of the campaign. I had a few conversations with Phil Gallagher, who I'm still in touch with on and off, and we combined our patchy memories on both those titles and produced an outline, and I filled in the gaps. So yeah, essentially the director's cut allowed me to restore the campaign as best I could to its original intention, and I was very happy to do that.
Yeah, that must have been a real like sense of achievement to finally cap that
Yeah,
campaign off.
yeah.
That's great. I mean, 10 volumes of, of that campaign. Have you done a full playthrough of that? How long does that take to complete?
I don't know, but Andy Law is currently live streaming that very thing.
Sure, yeah.
And yeah, he's using all the resources, all 10 volumes, plus a bunch of stuff, because he was initially the developer on that project for Cubicle 7. And so he has ideas of his own that didn't make it into print. But yeah, he's doing a live stream, and I forget how many thousands of people are watching it, but you can find it on YouTube. And we'll have to see how long it takes. I'm thinking probably 3 or 4 years at least.
Surely, yeah, because there's just so much quality material to explore in there. So that's great. And one other thing that I wanted to just touch on was that
Mm.
you did work on and it's a completely separate topic, but you did a fighting fantasy book as well.
Yes, I did.
Midnight Rogue. What
Yeah,
how did you end up writing that book? And I suppose also, how different is it writing a game book to writing a role-playing book?
right. Well, you know, obviously I've been aware of fighting fantasy from the beginning, and I'd kept an eye on game books. For Imagine magazine, I co-wrote an article on game books with Colin Greenland, who was their fiction critic at the time. And actually, through a chance encounter in a Durham pub, I ended up doing a game book spot on the BBC Radio Newcastle children's book program for a little while.
Right.
And when I moved down to Nottingham, we didn't see much of Steve and Ian because they were still in London and mostly focused on fighting fantasy because you know Bryan was running the show now. But they did come up from time to time for board meetings, and I had a couple of conversations with Steve and got on with him really well. And he'd seen I'd written for Warlock magazine. Which had also moved to Nottingham. Mark Gascoigne was sitting at a desk opposite mine editing that. And so, you know, it just sort of progressed. I wrote a few articles. I wrote a 200 paragraph adventure for the magazine. And I said to Mark, you know, who would I talk to about getting to write an actual book? And he put me in touch with Puffin, and off we went. Here's an interesting piece of trivia. The original working title for Midnight Rogue was Prince of Thieves. This was before the Kevin Costner movie. But Ian vetoed that on the grounds that, you know, he had his book City of Thieves. And I thought my title was a tribute to that because it was also set in Port Blacksand. But he didn't want to lose any sales through confusion of the titles. So Puffin decided it would be called Midnight Rogue.
Oh, right, okay. Well, yeah, and it's quite unusual in that it's one of the it's a fighting fantasy book where you're playing a sort of anti-hero, right? You're
Mm,
not an out and out good guy in the book.
right.
So
Yeah.
what sort of gave you the idea to tackle a game book structure in that way?
Well, basically, it was because I still had my Woofrup head on. And I thought that, let's have a go at doing WFRP in fighting fantasy. And that's the long and the short of it. I was obsessed with city adventures and rogue type adventures at the time, and I just wanted to do one of those. And I did. And the initial feedback from Puffin was that I remember this line in their feedback letter saying, "We need more combat. It is fighting fantasy after all." Whereas I'd made it far too sneaky, and it was possible to get through the whole thing without a combat in the first draft if you were smart and sneaky. Um, and so, yeah, I rewrote it. The second draft, had a lot more combat in, and a little mini dungeon at the end. Um, as to the experience of writing it, it's the same as I found with writing fiction, is that there isn't a GM, so you can't kind of shirk anything and say, this is for the GM to decide, or, according to the tastes of your gaming group, or any of all of those letouts are closed to you. So you have to cover everything. And I remember making an enormous flowchart on a piece of A3 paper in very small writing, showing where all the different paragraphs linked up, and I hand wrote out all the numbers from 1 to 400 and crossed them off as I used them, and so a very different writing process from a tabletop role-playing adventure, but still a lot of fun.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine as much fun as it must be, it's also it sounds like there's a certain amount of stress in in trying to write a game book that maybe doesn't exist in quite the same way for other
You,
types of fiction and games.
no, you have to be very organized and keep track of things, because once you lose a connection, it's like knitting. You basically have to pull the whole thing apart and start again.
So you've then went on to do lots of other work across RPGs and the sort of RPG industry and
Mm,
many other things over time. But more recently, you've been working with Nant Games, I think it is, on their
that's right.
Mythwalker game. What's sort of how have you ended up working on that kind of video game space, and how does that differ from role playing games?
Right. Well, for this, we need to go back to about 1993, which is when I started. Well, let's say 1991. I got some freelance contracts to write a story for a video game called Castles, an old interplay game, which was basically a resource management game where you're building a castle and you have to decide, how many troops you have guarding the castle while it's being built, how many workers, how you feed them, how all the resources and everything else. And they had storylines in this one expansion that I worked on. Called the Northern Campaign, and it developed out of my game book writing, because again it was interactive fiction. It was numbered paragraphs to all intents and purposes. You made choices. Instead of flipping to another page, the computer just showed you the next bit. Um, so the writing process was very similar to that, and that was my first foray into computer games. And then by about 1993, Microprose UK had become basically Games Workshop in exile. Mike Brunton was there, Jim Bambra was there, Stephen Hand, the designer of Chainsaw Warrior and Fury of Dracula, he was also there. And I I was looking to return to the UK for family reasons and others. And so they got me an interview and I got a job there, and I worked there for a little while. Didn't last long, sadly, not long enough for me to get a title out, because Microprose at the time, as video gamers probably know, specialized in doing combat flight sims. Um, Not the only thing they did, but it's what they were known for. And they had a competitor called Spectrum Holobyte, who also did combat flight sims, and who purchased Microprose, both UK and US, with the sole intention of shutting them down.
Right.
So that happened, and we were all made redundant. Um, But then I got another job in the States in a company where Ken Rolston was working, who, of course, I'd met when he was in Britain writing Something Rotten in Kislev. And also working there were old D&D luminaries like Lawrence Schick and Zeb Cook. And we were doing CD-ROM games. I started doing one combat RPG based on the Highlander franchise because the TV series was going great guns at that time.
Right.
But as is often the case in the industry, the money ran out, the company went bust, and the game was never finished. But yeah, so I've been I've had a foot in either camp tabletop and digital gaming ever since. Yeah, I've racked up something like 40 video game titles that have actually shipped. And that half of my resume brought me to the attention of Nant Games, which is a new company, but based on people who used to work on titles like EverQuest and Halo.
Right.
And they're a sister company of Nant Studios, who owns the sound stages where The Mandalorian is filmed, and they're very big into TV and film production. So since July of last year, I've been helping. It's a curious parallel to my work on WFRP. Actually, I arrived to see a setting in development and was asked to take over development of it, the setting and storyline, as the lead narrative designer. So I'm doing that. It was announced just last week. It's currently in a closed beta test, and I'm very, very restricted in what I can say about it, sadly.
Right.
But if anyone is interested, go to mythwalker.com and you will see all the currently available information on the game. A couple of trailers, and I apologize in advance. I appear in both of them. But yeah, I'm having a great time with it.
That's terrific. Because I mean, I don't know how much you can say about the world that it's set in, but is it a fantasy setting, and it's sort of
It is, yeah. It's a fantasy world, and the game itself is a mobile game with a strong geolocation element. So, as with games like Pokemon Go, you're walking around this world, but you're also interacting with the other world. And there's an element of going to be an element of mythology to it. And I'm really skirting close to what I think I'm allowed to say here,
that's okay.
But yeah, it's a fantasy world that lies on the other side of the veil, and which you can view through your device and help resolve a big crisis that is the main storyline.
It's fun. I mean, it sounds then like there is definitely the echoes of working on a role playing game in that kind of video game making, I suppose.
Yes.
There's a similar sort of discipline, even though your pen and paper has become the sort of code and all that sort of stuff. There's still must be a similar way to tackle the problems that come up in that sort of writing process.
Oh yes, definitely. And as with fiction and game books, you can't rely on an external GM. You've got to. So that's the big sort of more discipline is required in designing quests and scenarios and so on. At the same time, you've got to sort of like the Truman Show. You can't have people finding the wall. It's got to look completely open world and completely free while guiding people along the storyline subtly. So that's the big writing challenge. But yeah, to all intents and purposes, it is a role-playing game. We're calling it a GRPG, a geolocation role-playing game. So you create and develop characters and so on. Yeah, it's so far it's been a lot of fun.
It sounds great, yeah. And then, is there anything Yeah, I was going to ask then about just going back to Wolfrup for a moment.
Mm.
Obviously, having come back to that after a number of years and been able to complete the enemy within and sort of see Cubicle 7 sort of live up to that. And obviously, you've also updated some of your adventures and written some more stuff for those. Is there
Mm.
any chance there might ever be more of your work in the Wolfrup space, do you think?
Um, I don't know. That's a question for Cubicle 7 or
Right.
whoever succeeds them as the license holder. Um, I've, ever since basically the fans kept Wolfram 1 alive in the hiatus between Flame and Hogshead. And ever since then, I felt, quite humbled by that and by the passion and devotion that Wolfram has inspired. So yeah, if I'm able and if called upon, I'm always happy to return to that world. But I have to say there are no immediate plans.
Sure. Well, certainly one I'll be keeping my fingers crossed for there. But
Brilliant.
that's terrific, Graham. Thank you so much for taking some time to chat to me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
Huge thanks go out to Graeme Davis for taking the time to talk to me, sharing so many fun stories, and such a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I have learned so much stuff here that is going to inform my upcoming series on the history of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So keep an eye on the channel for that. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to support my continuing work documenting the greatest games ever made and speaking to the legends who made them, then consider checking out my Patreon, my Ko-fi, or even just joining my Discord. I've put links to all of those down below in the description. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks to Graeme Davis once again. I am Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.